look at our next lesson in the Civil War. It's called the Wilderness Campaign. Our objectives are to describe brief details about the battles of the Wilderness, Spotsylvania Courthouse, and Cold Harbor, and know the impact these battles had on the outcome of the Civil War. Look at your vocabulary words. The gradual wearing away of morale and the power to resist by persistent attacks is attrition. The lack of equality between things or people is disparity. Part of a defensive fortification that sticks out toward the enemy is salient. Have you ever struggled with writing a term paper? You think and write and erase and think some more. You start writing again, only to crumple the paper in disgust. You stop writing completely and put the paper aside, wishing it would go away. And as the deadline approaches, however, you realize the thing has to be written no matter what. Finally, you grit your teeth and dive in, more determined than ever not to stop until it is finished. After a couple years of warfare, Ulysses S. Grant realized he was going to have to stop. He was going to have to go after Robert Lee no matter what. If the Civil War was to end any time soon, Lee would have to be beaten again and again. Grant realized full well this meant a great deal of sacrifice and blood, but he was determined to make it happen. Today's lesson covers the first portion of that campaign and involves three major battles that tested the resolve of his army and the nation. Grant and Lee meet in the Wilderness, May 5th through 7th, 1864. Okay, so on your notes, the first thing I want is today's date, and we're going to write Wilderness. On May 4th, 1864, the Army of the Potomac crossed the Rapidan River and started to march down into Virginia. They ventured into a jungle-like area known as the Wilderness. It was an area full of undergrowth, which many thought would make fighting almost impossible. Grant was hoping that he could bring Lee into battle in the open country farther to the south past the Wilderness. Okay, so the Wilderness was full of undergrowth. Full of undergrowth. Okay. It said that Grant went into the Wilderness. He wanted to fight Lee in a battle in the open country on the other side of the Wilderness. So Grant hoped to fight Lee in the open country on the other side of the Wilderness. So he didn't go in the Wilderness to fight Lee in the Wilderness. That wasn't his goal. But General Lee, when learning of the fact that Grant was marching toward him, decided to attack his foe, thinking the terrain would help him offset the disparity in numbers. Grant did not shy away from the oncoming fight, even though it was not on the kind of ground he wanted. So as soon as Lee realized that Grant was marching straight towards him, Lee attacked. Now remember, Grant's for the Union, Lee's for the Confederates. The Wilderness was not a good place for a battle to take place. It would be difficult for the Union Army to maneuver since the roads were so narrow and few. Farm clearings were scarce. It was hard to see 50 yards in any direction. This was the same kind of terrain Lee dealt with at Chancellorsville when he had so much success the year before. He hoped to achieve the same results. Okay, so let's talk about the Wilderness. It says that the Wilderness was not a good place to fight. Okay, the Wilderness wasn't a good place to fight. It wasn't a good place to fight. Okay, so we said that the wilderness is full of undergrowth. Grant hoped to fight Lee in the open country on the other side. That's why Grant went in the wilderness. But as soon as Lee realized Grant was marching straight towards him, he attacked. We said the wilderness wasn't a good place to fight, so we're going to list a few reasons why the wilderness wasn't a good place to fight. Okay, number 1. Hard to maneuver. Okay. It's hard for Union to maneuver. Okay. It's they have narrow roads. And it also said the roads were few, so I'm going to put few there. Now remember, this isn't like an open country. This is wilderness. There's trees, there's vines, there's bushes. It's very difficult to get through there. It says it's hard to see 50 yards in any direction, and that's because of the trees, the weeds, everything, so it's hard to see. And it said 50 yards. So you couldn't see any distances. All you could see really is what's right in front of you. Now, I put Union here. It's hard for the Union to maneuver because remember it said that the Confederates fought in this type of territory when they fought in Chancellorsville. And remember, the Confederates had some success in Chancellorsville. Okay. Lee was successful. 2 C's and 2 S's. Okay. Lee was successful the last time they fought I'm going to put in a wilderness. And I'm going to draw a line, and I'm going to put Chancellorsville. So if it asks, you know, when did they fight in the wilderness before, you know, it was Chancellorsville. Chancellorsville. Okay. So on May 5th, the battle started. Now it says Lee attacked. Remember, the wilderness wasn't a good place to fight. It was hard for the Union to maneuver. It had narrow roads and very few of them. It's hard to see 50 yards in front of you. Lee was successful the last time they fought in a wilderness, which was Chancellorsville. Okay, so let's find out what happens. Okay, so May 5th, the battle starts. Okay, so I'm going to put May 5th, the battle starts. The Union had an advantage in artillery, but it couldn't be used here. The wilderness turned out to be a series of small battles, all carried on independently of one another. Okay, so the Union had more artillery. The Union had more artillery. But you couldn't use it in a wilderness because you don't know who you're fighting. You can't see enough far enough ahead of you to know if you're fighting the enemy or if you're shooting your own men. So they couldn't use it. The wilderness turned out to be a series of small battles, all carried on independently of one another. The inability to see the enemy was enhanced by the smoke from rifles. Okay. So, they couldn't see anyway. But remember, now there's smoke from the rifles. So it's making it even more difficult to see. Made it even... Okay, you can't see that. Okay, so we saw on May 5th, the battle starts. The Union had more artillery, but they couldn't use it. Okay. And we said the smoke from the rifles. Smoke from rifles. Reduced visibility even further. Reduced visibility. Okay, so this sounds like a very difficult place to fight. The inability to see the enemy was enhanced by the smoke from rifles and the unfortunate ease with which the woods caught on fire. Okay. Woods caught on fire easily. Caught fire easily. So when they shoot the rifle, there's a good chance it's going to catch the woods on fire. In fact, during the battle, many wounded soldiers burned to death. That's pretty sad, isn't it? As night fell, the pace of the fighting slowed, but a good number of the troops continued to fight throughout the evening. Okay. So many wounded soldiers. Burned to death. I would say it probably wasn't a good idea for Grant to go in the wilderness. The next day, the Federals, now think, the Federals or the Union, so we're talking about the Union, the Federals launched an assault that was close to crushing the Confederate right flank, only to be repulsed at the last minute. Confederate General James Longstreet launched a counterattack, and after hours of fighting, his army was finally beaten back. By the end of the day, no ground was gained. After 2 days of fighting, the Union had suffered 17,000 casualties and had not gained an inch of real estate. Okay, we said on May 5th the battle starts. The Union had more artillery, but they couldn't use it in the woods because the artillery and the rifles, there's a good chance once you shot them that it was going to catch the woods on fire. The smoke from the rifles reduced visibility, and the woods did catch on fire easily. Many wounded soldiers burned to death. Many of those soldiers that were wounded wouldn't have even died. So many of the wounded soldiers didn't die from their injuries, they died from the fire. Okay, and it says, so the next day, the Federals attacked the Confederate right flank, attacked the Confederate right flank, Confederate, okay, now let's talk about the Confederate General Longstreet, General Longstreet counterattacked and his army was badly beaten back. It says by the end of the day, no ground was gained. No ground was gained by the end of the second day. By end of day. Okay. The next day, the Federals attacked the Confederate right flank. Confederate General Longstreet counterattacked. No ground was gained by the end of the day by either side. Okay. No ground was gained, but it said that the Union had 17,000 casualties. The Union had, that means 17,000 soldiers died in this battle. Casualties. I think that looks like a U. Let's make it look like a U. There. One could say that this was a bigger disaster than Chancellorsville had been. Many in the Federal Army assumed they would, as usual, start their march back toward D.C. and try again a few months down the road to return and attack Lee, once the Army had recovered and resupplied itself. What was different about this campaign from previous attempts at going after Lee was that this time Grant was in charge. Remember, the other generals were afraid to fight. General Grant wasn't afraid to fight. He would fight. So this one's going to be different. On the evening of May 7th, Grant stopped fighting and marched his army south. Okay. So the first day was May 5th. This is May 6th. So on May 7th, this is the third day. So day 3. I'm going to put day 3. Grant stopped fighting and marched his army south. He would try to outflank Lee, which would lead to the next major battle between these two generals. So he marched south. Grant stopped fighting and he marched south. Marched south. Okay, so Grant has a plan. Okay. So we said the next day the Federals attacked the Confederates' right flank. Confederate General Longstreet counterattacked. No ground was gained by the end of the day. The Union had 17,000 casualties. I don't know what the Confederates had. So a lot of men died in this battle. On day 3, Grant stopped fighting and marched south. Okay? So that's the end of the Wilderness Battle. But now we're going to talk about another battle. We're going to talk about Spotsylvania Courthouse. Okay. Spotsylvania Courthouse. Spotsylvania Courthouse. May 8th through the 21st. Now remember, May 7th is the day he marched south, so the very next day they're in another battle. Okay? Grant's plan was to force the battle upon Lee. He hoped to gain control of the country town known as Spotsylvania Courthouse. So this is the name of a town. Like Gettysburg, it was a town where many different roads intersected. If Grant could get his men to this town ahead of Lee's, he would be between the Army of North Virginia and Richmond. He would then have to do the attacking. Lee would then have to do the attacking, which would certainly mean defeat for the rebels. Okay. So Spotsylvania Courthouse was where many roads intersected. Okay, so this was important because many roads intersected. Okay. Lee was surprised by Grant's move, but he was still able to get his men to the town before Grant. Well, Lee made it there first. Lee arrived before Grant. So that kind of just, let's see what happens. Lee arrived before Grant. The fight that took place lasted 10 days. The terrain was very similar to the Wilderness, as were the problems each army encountered. In addition, the Confederates had constructed a formidable salient facing the oncoming Union Army. It would be difficult to take. Now remember, we said a salient was a part of a defense fortification that sticks out toward the enemy. Alright. Okay. So it says that the terrain was like the Wilderness. And it says, so they had a lot of the same problems here that they had when they fought in the Wilderness. And it said the Confederates were able to fortify their defenses, is what that is saying. When it says they constructed a formidable salient facing the oncoming Union Army, that means they had time to fortify their defenses. So the Confederates fortified their defenses. Okay? So it says, now the next battle was Spotsylvania Courthouse. Many roads intersected here, so we know this is an important town for transportation. Lee arrived before Grant. Grant wanted to get there before Lee, but Lee got there before Grant. The terrain was just like the Wilderness, so they had a lot of problems like they had the Wilderness, but the Confederates fortified their defenses. So this is going to be harder for Grant than Grant thought it would be. As the fight developed, Grant's army kept on edging around, trying to get around the rebel left flank and between the Confederates and Richmond. The Federals never quite achieved their goal. The result was that both armies continued to sidestep and fight. The toll in human life was immense. Most of the battle was fought hand to hand, meaning many were killed by bayonets rather than bullets. Okay, so Grant's goal is to try to get around the rebel left flank and between the Confederates and Richmond. Grant's goal was to get around the Confederate left flank and separate the Confederates and Richmond. Confederates and Richmond. Okay, that was his goal. He said he never could accomplish that because both armies continued to sidestep and fight. It says the armies fought hand to hand. To hand. Meaning that there were many casualties. Many people were killed in this battle. Many casualties. And many killed with bayonets. Although the Confederate troops were inflicting heavier casualties on the Union force, they were becoming too weak to launch any kind of counterattack. In addition, the losses Grant suffered were being replaced by fresh troops. The men in gray did not have that luxury. There were no reinforcements, no supplies. Grant was going to fight and make this a war of attrition. Grant finally withdrew and continued running a course toward Petersburg and Richmond. In the meantime, Lee scrambled to stay ahead of the Union Army. They would meet up again 10 days later at Cold Harbor. It said Grant was going to fight and make this a war of attrition. Remember, attrition means the gradual wearing away of morale and the power to resist by persistent attacks. So what this is saying is Grant is going to keep attacking Lee until he wears them out, until they just can't defend themselves anymore. Okay? We said that Grant's goal was to arrive there first, but Lee arrived there before Grant. The terrain was like the wilderness, but the Confederates have time to fortify their defenses. Grant's goal was to get around the Confederate left flank and separate the Confederates and Richmond. What happened was the armies fought hand to hand. There were many casualties, and many were killed with bayonets. Okay? In fact, there were more killed with bayonets than bullets. Okay? And it said what's going on here is the Confederates, that means Confederates, inflicted heavier casualties on the Union Army, on Union but they were just becoming too weak. So the Confederates were getting too weak to counterattack. Now it said the men in gray did not have the luxury. So who do you suppose the men in gray were? Obviously the men in gray were the Confederates. I'm going to put gray here. And put it in parentheses. Okay. We've said that Grant's men were being replaced with fresh troops. So Grant had fresh troops. Remember, the Confederates don't have that. The Confederates didn't have any reinforcements, no supplies. And it said Grant was going to keep attacking the South and wearing them out. Okay, he was going to make this a war of attrition. War of attrition. Keep attacking and wear them out. So Grant knew the South was getting weak. He knew they didn't have fresh supplies, so he's going to take advantage of it. Okay. Then we said the armies fought hand to hand. There were many casualties. Many were killed with bayonets. The Confederates inflicted heavier casualties on the Union, but the Confederates were getting too weak to counterattack, and we said that the Confederates wore the gray uniforms. Grant, the North, had fresh troops, and Grant was going to make this a war of attrition. He was going to keep attacking until he just wore the South out, until they just couldn't defend themselves anymore. Okay. Grant finally withdrew and continued running a course toward Petersburg and Richmond. In the meantime, Lee scrambled to stay ahead of the Union Army. They would meet up again 10 days later at Cold Harbor. Okay. So let's talk about Cold Harbor. The Union Army continued its journey toward Richmond, with Lee doing what he could to head them off. Outnumbered 2-1, he could do little to stop the advance and hoped to secure a victory that would stall the Federal offensive. His troops dug in at a small crossroads in central Virginia, Cold Harbor. As the soldiers dug trenches in preparation for the upcoming battle, they unearthed skeletal remains from previous conflicts at that location. Despite such a horror of war, it would be here that the Confederate Army would win its greatest victory in terms of casualties. Okay, so the Union Army is moving towards Richmond. Okay, the Union is moving towards Richmond. And it said they outnumbered the South 2-1. outnumbered South 2-1. That means there's twice as many in the Union Army that there are in the Confederate Army. So it said that Lee Lee dug trenches. Okay, they dug trenches to get ready for the battle. To prepare for battle. And when they did, they found skeletal remains. And found skeletal remains. That was from the previous battles that they fought there. The actual battle began on June 1st. Okay, so June 1st, 1864, the battle begins. The actual battle began on June 1st, 1864, with a series of assaults on Confederate positions around Old Cold Harbor. The attacks did little other than point out the strengths and weaknesses of the Southern forces. The major assault was scheduled for June 3rd, after newly arrived troops could rest. While waiting for the attack, Lee's forces constructed an elaborate series of entrenchments that gave his artillery a line of fire to any location. This would prove to be very deadly for Union forces. Okay, so they got to Cold Harbor. The Union was moving toward Richmond, and they outnumbered the South 2-1. Lee dug trenches to prepare for the battle, and he found skeletal remains. On June 1st, the battle begins. Okay, so the battle began, and we said that so the Union just got fresh troops. So the fresh troops would attack on June 3rd. So in the meantime, these 2 days here, the South didn't just sit there. Lee constructed an elaborate series of entrenchments. Okay. So he established there's no T there. Entrenchments that gave his artillery a line of fire to any location. For artillery to fire at any location. So it's kind of like the tortoise and the hare. The hare went to sleep, and the tortoise just kept going. So while the Union is sleeping and resting, the Confederates are busy getting ready for this battle. Okay. It said this will prove to be very deadly for Union forces. As the Northern Army prepared for the attack on June 3rd, many soldiers understood what was about to happen. They had been in battles before and knew that the Confederate positions were well protected. Many Union troops were so sure of the outcome that they pinned their names to the inside of their uniforms so their bodies could be identified later. One such paper was found on the body of a dead Union soldier. On it he had written in his diary that he was going to be killed that day. So the Union soldiers they knew that the Confederate positions were well protected. Confederate positions were well protected. They pinned their names to the inside of their uniforms. To inside of uniforms so they could be identified later. So for identification. Sure enough, the Union assault began the next morning. In very short order, the Federal attack was devastated by Confederate fire. It is estimated that the Union Army suffered more than 7,000 casualties in 20 minutes. So, on June 3rd, the fighting started. The Union, 7,000 casualties. 7,000 casualties in 20 minutes. So Grant is losing a lot of men. We said the Union got fresh troops and they wanted them to rest, so they said that they would wait and attack on June 3rd. So while the Union's resting, Lee built entrenchments for his artillery to fire at any location. The Union soldiers, many of them realized that the Confederate positions were well protected, and they pinned their names to the inside of their uniforms for identification. June 3rd, the fighting started. The Union had 7,000 casualties in 20 minutes. For the next 9 days, the two armies dug in and fought a trench war, with neither side winning any kind of advantage. Snipers and constant cannon bombardments took their toll. Finally, Grant called for a temporary truce so wounded soldiers could be attended to. The Union then packed up. Rather than head to Washington, Grant ordered his troops to continue the march toward Petersburg, a suburb of Richmond. The war of attrition was not going to end for the exhausted Confederate Army. Okay. So we said that they fought for 9 more days. We'll say they fought a trench war. For 9 more days. Grant called a temporary truce. We could tend to wounded soldiers. To attend to wounded soldiers. And you continued towards Petersburg. Continued to Petersburg. Despite a series of losses, Grant continued his march toward Richmond. This caused Lee to constantly scramble his forces in an effort to head off the inevitable attack on the Confederate capital. Grant's war of attrition was quickly taking its toll on the Southern forces in a number of ways. Lee did not have the time to replenish his forces. Due to the much larger workforce in the North, new troops were being added to the war almost daily. The Confederacy did not have this manpower to pull from. Alright, so I better write this down. So Grant's idea of this war of attrition is working. Union continued to Petersburg, and that's near Richmond. Okay? Now Richmond is the capital city. Alright? So the war of attrition is affecting the South. Affecting the South. Number 1, no time. We had no time to replenish forces. The North had new troops. I'm going to put daily. It was almost daily, so we'll just put daily. The Confederacy didn't have the manpower, so only the North got new troops daily, the South didn't. Okay, 2, an extreme lack of resources in the South meant the troops could not be provided with food, ammunition, and clothing. Many Confederate troops were being forced to march and fight without shoes, for example. Meanwhile, the Union Army had a steady stream of fresh clothes and supplies sent to them. Okay, so 2, Lee had a lack of resources. Lack of resources. I'm going to put shoes, clothes, food. I said Lee because remember, the North doesn't have a lack of resources. The lack of manpower meant many Confederate troops were fighting all the time with little to no rest, while fresh divisions were employed by the North. Okay, so 3, Lee's army really had no or little rest. Okay. So they said they fought the trench war for 9 more days. Grant called a temporary truce to attend to wounded soldiers. The Union continued to Petersburg. The war of attrition was affecting the South because Lee had no time to replenish forces. The North had new troops daily. Lee had a lack of resources. shoes, clothes, and food, and Lee had no or little time to rest. So his soldiers are getting tired. Okay? So let's review. Before completing the problem set, make sure you understand the main points of the lesson. Knowing he was going to have to defeat Lee to win the war, Grant chose to fight a war of attrition against Lee's army. Thus, a series of campaigns began which included the Wilderness, Spotsylvania, and Cold Harbor. Despite staggering defeats in each of these battles, the Union Army pressed on toward Richmond, Virginia. In the meantime, the Southern Army continued to dwindle without adequate supplies, while the Union Army grew larger and stayed well supplied. It would just be a matter of time before the Confederate Army would be too exhausted to fight any longer. Grant knew this would be the eventual outcome of his war of attrition. Okay, I want you to study your notes, study the lesson, and then answer the questions.